Welcome to the Darkstream, VoxDay, voxday.net, and unauthorized.tv. Thanks for firing it up. It is Monday, and I'm told the audio is good, the video is good. We've got 10 folks already on unauthorized chat. DLive chat is rolling, and super chats are live. So, the Sea Guard, a little bit of a joke there. Back when I played a little Warhammer fantasy battle, I used to play High Elves, and the Sea Guard were my actual favorite unit. So anyhow, that was hence the temptation to use that in the title. But what I'm really referring to there in terms of the changing of the Sea Guard is actually the end of 80 years of U.S. Navy dominance. For 80 years, the U.S. has ruled the sea. While there are still some people with connections to the Navy who would tend to disagree with me, I would point out that this is probably just another example of the experts not being able to see the forest for the trees. You know, for a long time, first the Spanish, then the Dutch, and then the English Navy ruled the oceans. And that was always the key to imperial power. You can't rule a massive overseas empire if you don't have control of the seas. But, and what was interesting about the way that the English dominated was that they managed to actually bridge the transformation from sail to steam, and then from steam to modern armored ships, all the while staying in control of the seas. Nobody managed to leapfrog them using technology. What finally accounted for the decline of British sea power was the costs of World War I and World War II, both in terms of money and in terms of manpower. Excuse me. But also the transformation from the battleship to the aircraft carrier. Aircraft carriers are much more expensive and much more complicated to make than battleships. Also, they require a bigger investment because the planes that go on the aircraft carriers are also very expensive. And the sheer cost of that and all of the maintenance, not just maintenance, but support that's required is incredible. You don't just need sailors, you actually need a whole fleet of other ships around the aircraft carrier to protect it. Every carrier group has at least 2 submarines, a cruiser, a number of destroyers, and so forth. Bugbear sends in a super chat. Thank you, Bugbear. He says, appreciating the conflict updates. It's hard to keep track on top of Delta Dad Life. Well, Delta Dad Life is the best life, so that should be your priority. But happy to do what I can to keep things and keep folks informed. What I look at, pretty much any of you can look at. But if my doing so, excuse me. Get some mints or something. It's gonna be a rather unpleasant one if I keep coughing the whole time. I'll mute this. I don't know what's going on there. I haven't been coughing at all for the last hour. Then all of a sudden I start talking and boom. Anyhow, so the stuff that I look at, Big Surge, Simplicius, Reminiscing the Future, was that Black something or other, the Chinese Global Ministry, or the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Global Times, CGNT. These are good Lord. Anyhow, these counterbalance the mainstream media. They obviously have bias themselves, but they provide a fundamentally different message, different information, and allow you. Oftentimes, there's not direct conflict between what the two sides are saying, but the mainstream media in particular likes to put a false spin on things and leave you with the wrong impression, even when they provide you with the correct data. So, and of course, given that it's the mainstream media, sometimes it's just complete nonsense in the first place. How many times have we heard that Russia's going to run out of anti-aircraft missiles, artillery shells? Putin, I think, has died of 7 different diseases already. It's all nonsense. So, but what I can, I think, help with a bit is to help put some of it in perspective. I'll give you an example. Today, I was talking about, and this is related to what we're talking about now, the change in who's on top with regards to sea power. The big change is that China's industrial capacity now completely dwarfs that of the entire West. It's not even close. And someone on Social Galactic was saying, well, our one saving grace is China's birth rate. And, first of all, China's actually pretty aggressively addressing its birth rate issues. They got rid of the one-child policy. They now permit 3 children, and in fact, they're providing incentives to some young women to have children. If they need to offer more incentives, they will. They're aware of the problem. They're on top of the problem. They may not have solved it yet, but they will solve it because it's not a difficult problem to solve. But beyond that, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in the slightest. Why can I say that? Well, consider this. The big flaw, the big problem that the Germans had with Operation Barbarossa, which, by the way, was incredibly successful. The Germans did exactly what they hoped to do. They launched their invasion. They destroyed massive numbers of Soviet divisions. What they didn't calculate on, what they didn't believe possible, was they didn't believe that it was going to be possible for the Soviets to replace those divisions. And yet they did. I was reading Zhukov's memoirs, and he found some stuff in the German officers' notes that at one point they were wargaming for a total of 40 Russian divisions. They upped that they upped their plan to be prepared to face 200 divisions. And by the end of that year, remember the invasion began in June 1941, by the end of 1941, they had already counted 390 Soviet divisions. And when I say counted, they had already encountered them. I believe the total number of, I've seen 2 different numbers for the total number of Soviet divisions. One was 592, and the other was 800. I think the truth is somewhere in between there. I think the 592 division number indicates divisions that were actually formed and actually trained. I think the 800 was the number that they had planned on paper and had people identified who were going to be conscripted into those divisions. But the point is, the Nazis planned to face 200 divisions. They ended up facing somewhere between 600 and 800. And that was with a young male population. Let me make sure I got the numbers straight here. I'm going to pop over to the blog and check it out because I wrote it down there. Actually, no, it's on Social Galactic. Anyhow, that was with a population, young male population, available man pool of around 14 million. So they had 14 million young men of military age, and they managed to put together at least 600 divisions out of that. Now, guess how many young men of military age China has right now? They have 117 million young men of military age. Which means if you do the math using the Soviet mobilization as a guide, that means that they could theoretically afford to mobilize 6,720 divisions. The United States currently has 27 divisions. The peak U.S. military was 91 divisions during World War II. Okay? So what that means is that the U.S. cannot possibly afford to get into any sort of land war with China. Can't do it. You know. Furthermore, the quality of the Chinese soldiers on an individual basis is actually higher than the average of the U.S. military. That wasn't true in 1940. Back in 1940, the U.S. was a European country. It was a reasonably homogeneous, almost entirely European country. The military was entirely European. Now, the U.S. is, especially with regards to young men of military age, the U.S. is a mestizo country. It's got about half whites, and the rest are a mix of Africans, Hispanics, Asians, etc., etc. So the quality of the U.S. military is not only going to be worse than it was, it's going to be worse than the Russians, than the Chinese, etc. That's the way it works. And so what the saving grace of the United States is that it's got the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Pacific Ocean on the other. Plus, for 80 years, it has been the dominant naval power, right? But here's the issue. The issue is the U.S. no longer has any significant shipbuilding capacity. It has the capacity to build about 100,000 tons per year. Now, the problem with that is that if we just look at World War II, the current U.S. shipbuilding capacity is 1/5 the shipping tonnage total that Japan was able to produce in 1942. The peak that the U.S. was able to produce in shipping tonnage was 15 million in 1943. That's why the U.S. Navy beat the Imperial Japanese Navy. If you look at the size of the, if you look at the size of the IJN around the time that the war started, it was reasonably comparable to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The U.S. had responsibilities in the Atlantic. This is what led Michelle Malkin to completely miscalculate the number of aircraft carriers available. She literally didn't count Wasp or Hornet, Ranger, any of the Atlantic-based carriers. So she thought that the Japanese actually had more aircraft carriers than the U.S. did when the war started. Not actually true, but the point is the Japanese had a navy that was about the same size as the navy that they were facing. The problem is that in 1942, the delta between the U.S. production and the Japanese production of ship tonnage alone was 1,223%. The U.S. produced 6.25 million tons of ships. The Japanese produced 500,000. Both sides lost ships. The U.S. replaced them, and then some. The Japanese couldn't replace them. Same thing with aircraft. 1943 was actually the biggest divergence. The U.S. produced 85,900 military aircraft. The Japanese produced 16,700. So the U.S. was producing 5 times more ships, or 5 times more planes. Guess who's going to win the air war? Right? So, now here's where it gets scary. As I mentioned, the United States has an annual capacity of about 100,000 tons per year. China's shipyards have a capacity of 23 million tons. They have a shipbuilding capacity that is more than 200 times greater than the U.S. shipbuilding capacity. So it's not the fact that the Chinese have caught up to the U.S. in terms of the number of ships. That doesn't actually matter. What matters is if there is a sea battle, and there probably will be at some point, and the U.S. loses one carrier, and the Chinese lose all 3 of its carriers, it's not going to harm, that losing that one carrier is going to be much, much more harmful for the U.S. than losing all 3 carriers would be for the Chinese, because the Chinese will be able to replace all 3 immediately and then some. Ha! Azimuth says, what happened to old U.S. shipbuilding capacity? It's just a dry dock, right? No, not at all. It's about having a trained workforce. It's about having the tools. It's about having the materials. The U.S. threw it all away. In fact, some of that Chinese shipbuilding capacity was exported from the U.S. Jorville says, all Russia or China have to do is take out Newport News and we have 0 capacity to build carriers. That's correct. ID Prism says, I assume tech advantage is negligible at this stage in the game. Absolutely. The U.S., we're not talking about, blowing up 3rd-tier militaries in the desert anymore. We're talking about military peers. And what we've learned from Ukraine, and this is why we're seeing the de-dollarization, this is why we're seeing the rise of BRICS. 40 different countries want to join BRICS. The World Economic Forum is dying. And the U.S. doesn't have the steel producing capacity anymore. They got rid of that. And so, the U.S. still has good technology. The U.S. still has some smart people. But they don't have the industrial and military infrastructure that is designed to create effective weapons that can be mass produced. Because, like everything else, the military has been financialized. The primary purpose of manufacturing military weapons is for people to make money. And so, Azima says, they were really setting us up to get wiped out by China. By they, I assume that he means the Jewish diaspora, but China wouldn't let them in. That's really what it looks like. It's pretty clear that those ghost cities that were built were meant to house immigrants. But then Xi Jinping took power and canceled the whole thing. And remember, he cleaned house. He arrested over 650,000 Communist Party officials for corruption. Shadowman Bear says, we're literally the worst socialist country. We don't own the means of our own production. That's correct. Kelbear says, is Israel facing a civil war? No. I actually spoke to an Israeli contact today, and I was asking him about some of the stuff that's going on. It's from my understanding is that it's mostly Hezbollah looking to take advantage of both the Israeli political confusion as well as the fact that Fatah, I think it's Fatah, the main political rival in the Palestinian sections, state, whatever you want to call it, is whoever's been running that is very old and is not expected to survive long. And so it's probably, politically speaking, in terms of winning over Palestinian hearts and minds, this would be a good time for Hezbollah to benefit from creating agitation. So I think that some minor form of war between Israel and Hezbollah, not necessarily like anything like what was it, 2008. I don't think we're talking about any like sort of invasion of Lebanon or Syria, but I do think that there's going to be more heat. So we'll have to see. Ladumba says, and to top it all, add the side effects of the vax to the Western population. Sure, but there's a fair amount of vax in China as well. We don't really know what's up. Although, if it is true that Russia and China have placebos, yeah, then that would be significant. Vermach Bear says, sounds like China did some swamp drainage for real. I think it looks that way. I do think it looks that way. And so, I don't expect, and based on my conversation with the Israelis, I don't expect a lot of conflict there. I was wondering, in fact, that's part of why I talked to them. I was wondering if things continued to heat up in Ukraine, if it was possible that Russia might seek to have Iran or Syria stir up some sort of excitement that would bring in the U.S. and distract the U.S. distract the U.S. from being able to focus on Eastern Europe. But he said, the guy that I talked to said they're not seeing any signs of that. So, and this is a guy who knows what he's talking about, very smart, very competent. So, I think what we're looking at here now is the possibility of Poland taking advantage of the situation, hopefully being smart enough to heed Putin's warning and just taking off their slice of Western Ukraine and staying out of conflict with Russia. Putin has pretty clearly signified he doesn't care if he does it, but he's also made it very clear that he doesn't want them being used to support NATO assaults. So anyhow, but all of this, and what's really interesting, and what we're already seeing, is some of the smarter neoclowns are encouraging they're encouraging the idea of making peace in Ukraine in order to pivot towards war with China. Now, this is, of course, nonsense and a terrible idea because the U.S. can't fight China. The U.S. already can't successfully fight Russia. There's absolutely no way that the Russians and the Chinese are going to permit themselves to be separated. Again, today, it was kind of funny. Reuters, or no, actually this time it was the Ukrainian news. Read this. I thought that this particular question and answer was pretty funny. Hang on, let me see if I can find it. There we go. So this is a question from the Ukrainian news directed at Mao Ning, who is one of the top foreign ministry spokespeople. Ukrainian news. From July 17th, after Russia's withdrawal from the Black Sea grain agreement, Russian military are attacking the Ukrainian port city of Odessa with missiles and drones every day. On Sunday night, the Russian military attacked the historic center of Odessa, protected under the World Heritage Convention, and damaged 29 historical sites. Several international organizations and countries strongly condemned Russia for such attacks. In particular, UNESCO said the intentional destruction of cultural sites may amount to a war crime, according to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2347. China is one of the founding countries of UNESCO and calls for the preservation of world cultural heritage. What is your comment, and has China contacted or plans to contact the Russian side on this matter? So they're just desperately trying to find some issue to create a wedge between China and Russia. And the Chinese foreign spokeswoman's response is, China's position on the Ukraine crisis is consistent and clear-cut. We hope that parties concerned will seek a political settlement of the Ukraine crisis and jointly work for de-escalation. In other words, yeah, they're not even going to get a strongly worded letter. They're not going to do anything. You know, the Chinese are absolutely 100% with the Russians. But they're not going to do anything because they don't need to. You know, Russia is doing exactly what they need Russia to do. And this just gives them more time, and they're actively building up their military. You know, they're actively building up their forces in preparation for the conflict with the U.S. military that the U.S. military is openly talking about. Mark D says, Vox, where can I subscribe to get notifications when you're live? Subscribe to the Telegram channel. we send out notifications through Telegram. You can also see them on Gab, I believe. Yeah, yesterday, I should mention, yesterday was Russia broke windows on Chinese embassy. And what was interesting about this spokeswoman's response to that was that she said, yeah, nobody was there. They'd already emptied out the whole embassy. It was actually the consulate, I think. Which, indicates that the Russians had let the Chinese know that the attacks were coming. So, anyhow, it will be interesting to see how it shakes out. But if you look at the logistics, and again, it's the logistics that matter, not the operational logistics, but the strategic logistics, the industrial capacity, the quality of the average demographic. If you look at those things, you can almost always determine which side is going to win. If you look at those numbers that are on the blog, you knew that Japan never had a chance. And here's the thing. The best Japanese military officers all knew that Japan didn't have a chance. The whole point was basically, their whole objective, Yamamoto talked about this. We bloody their nose and we make it clear that it's going to hurt if they're going to go to war with us. So hopefully they'll just leave us alone. That was a ridiculous idea. It was never going to work. The only way it would work is, gee, we hope the Americans don't care enough to go to war with us. But Roosevelt wanted to go to war with them. Roosevelt manipulated them into going to war with him. So it was a disaster from the start. Same thing with the Soviets. Hitler's idea was, we're going to destroy all their armies in the first 2 months. Then they're going to surrender, and then we can focus on getting ready for war with the U.S. Doesn't work. Never going to work. And now obviously there were some reasons why people were misled. The Germans had a poor opinion of the Soviets due to the fact that the Soviets lost during World War I and had to sue for peace because they were in the middle of fighting a civil war. The Bolsheviks quite rightly gave up whatever they had to give up on the Western Front so that they could focus on defeating the White Russians. That was a smart thing to do. But it taught the Germans the wrong lesson. By the same token, remember, the U.S. was not able to beat China and Korea. Even with their full World War II mobilization, even with the fact that China had been occupied by Japan, they couldn't beat the Chinese at the time. Now there's no chance. Now I very much doubt. I would say that China is the dominant sea power in the world. Maybe not in terms of if all the ships in both navies were to engage in some sort of massive battle. I think, the U.S. would probably win. And then 9 months later, all the new Chinese ships would completely swamp what was left of the U.S. Navy. No. In the age of industrial warfare, industrial capacity is the dominant factor. And so when you look at the situation, now you just have to look at with Ukraine. Back when the whole thing started, we had some friends from Ukraine that came down and stayed with us for a couple days before they moved on to Italy. And, they were understandably upset. I mean, they, their house and things in their neighborhood were being, shelled and stuff. But they couldn't believe that NATO was not going to be able to beat Russia. And I said, no, it's not going to happen. I said, there's absolutely no way that Ukraine. First of all, I said the war's not about Ukraine. The war's with NATO, and NATO can't beat them. And this was just impossible for them to believe at the time. Now, these are smart people. I'm sure they get it now. When one side is firing 1,000 shells a day and the other side is firing 20,000 shells a day, it's not hard to figure out who's going to win. It's just not difficult to figure out who's going to win. Will war lead to a ramp up of mining in places like West Australia and Canada? I would assume so. I would definitely assume so. Ukrainian losses are tragic. Just today in one battle for Robotin, they lost 40 armored units. Yeah, it's the problem is that the people who are the Kiev regime are not Ukrainian. They're not Ukrainian at all. They're all Jews. They couldn't care less about the Ukrainian people. They couldn't care less about it's just another tool that they can throw away. To be honest, it's actually very similar to Hitler's attitude towards the Germans. Use them while you got them. Throw them away. They don't really matter. They're not a precious resource to be harbored and protected. And so, in addition to that, all of the NATO tactics are outdated. The world and military technology has transformed greatly. Even here's the incredible thing, is that even the side with air superiority, which is Russia, doesn't dare to fly their planes over the battlefield. Air defenses now are so good, shoulder-mounted man pads, different types of air defenses, all of those things are so good that nobody can fly a plane. That's why there's so much drone activity, because a small drone can avoid all the missile defenses. But that's going to change soon too. As soon as the laser anti-aircraft, which is already being installed on some ships, as soon as that is small enough to be mounted on a truck, the drones aren't going to be valuable anymore either. The skies are already partially off limits. They're going to be completely off limits, and that's why NATO has been crippled, because NATO has always depended, and the USA has always depended on air supremacy. What are your thoughts on Canada's future? It's a big place and there's not too many people. I think that the best outcome is probably Western Canada being mostly of English stock, seceding and avoiding being overrun by the immigration that has overrun Eastern Canada. I don't. I mean, I have no respect for the Canadian government or the people that would elect such. I mean, for crying out loud, Castro's illegitimate son. It's crazy. Hawk says you can mass produce expendable drones like Lancet pilots and fighters, not so much. Well, yeah, that's the transition we've seen so far. We've seen the transition from mancraft to to drones. But that's only because the drones cannot be efficiently shot down by the air defenses and surface-to-air missiles. Once you've got lasers that can fire, 120 times in a second, or in 10 seconds, you can't mass produce enough drones to get past it. That's my prediction of the coming stage of the war. Not of this war, but right now, what we're seeing, in addition to seeing the handing over of the sea power baton from the United States to Canada, we're also seeing the end of the age of air power. Air power has been dominant and has been key to the U.S.'s use of sea power because it's been the aircraft carrier. The gunboat diplomacy of the U.S. over the last 60 years has been aircraft diplomacy. But that's coming to an end because, again, I think that they just set a new record. I was reading today, a Soviet missile, I believe fired from a Su-57, shot down a Ukrainian jet 400 kilometers away. So if you can shoot down missiles, if you can shoot down planes from 400 kilometers away, I mean, there's not really much point in flying planes anymore. Carriers are obsolete. Yeah, I think they essentially are in peer-based warfare. They're not obsolete, and they'll still be used to dominate second and third tier countries. Shadowmine Bear sends a super chat. Thank you. Drones with grenades and mortars became popular in Colombia around 2015-16 with FARC. Yeah, I mean, the whole ad hoc use of drones was fairly obvious. I don't think too many people were surprised by that. And now the drones are getting much better. I think the first war that we really saw how deadly drones could be was in the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It was just some of the drone-based attacks on the infantry in the trenches were just devastating. But I don't think that that's going to last too long. I mean, they can't fly jets now because all the soldiers have man pads. Well, as soon as all the soldiers have laser-based anti-air rifles, or whatever you end up calling them, once soldiers have man-portable anti-air lasers, that ends the drone threat. So, about piety. Is NATO concerned with China's acquisition of Africa? Yes, absolutely, but there's not a damn thing they can do about it. It's particularly ironic seeing the International Monetary Fund trying to warn African countries about the long-term danger of loans from China when China's doing exactly the same thing that the IMF has always done, only they are giving the Africans better deals. Space Marines getting closer by the day. Well, yeah, it's interesting though to think that the reason that we've all been reading science fiction. We all been waiting for the day that people will be carrying lasers instead of projectile weapons and so forth. We didn't realize that they were primarily going to be used against drones. So Felis is skeptical. I don't think China can take Africa. It's not called the Dark Continent for the color of their skin. Well, there's certainly reason for skepticism. And in the Empire of Dust, which produced that famous "it's just so tedious" meme, certainly the Chinese are not going to be able to transform the African population into quasi-Chinese any better than the Europeans were able to transform them into quasi-Europeans. But with the Chinese, they can be a little bit more brutal, and so if you read Seven Kill Tiger, it's actually a short story in There Will Be War Volume 10 that addresses that hypothetical situation. Ironically, it concerns vaccines being used to deliver a bioweapon. Imagine that. Crazy talk, huh? Couldn't possibly happen, right? So, anyhow, that's what's going on. So, keep in mind that we're not only in interesting times, we're not only in economically challenging times, but we are in a period of flux. We're at a historical nexus point. You need to keep your mind open about the possibilities, because your assumptions about historical inertia are almost certainly not going to hold in the current circumstances. So, I wish you all a good evening. If you're not subscribed to Unauthorized yet, I encourage you to do so. We've got some interesting stuff coming. I'm Vox Day, and this is the Darkstream.